Let's dive right into this explainer and explore a really fascinating paradox. When we think of global empires throughout history, we usually picture conquering armies, absolute monarchs, and borders drawn by brute force. But the modern era? It's given us something entirely different, something incredibly vast, and way more complex. I want you to imagine something for a second. What if the most powerful country in the world doesn't actually need to control other countries directly? Think about it. How does a single nation dictate the flow of global capital and commerce without actually owning every factory or commanding every single market? And what if it could shape international politics, steering the major decisions of entire nations and global institutions without ever formally ruling those foreign governments? Or project this incredible, overwhelming military power across thousands of miles of oceans and continents, all without permanently occupying most of the places it influences? It almost sounds impossible, right?
Well, that right there is the core paradox of American hegemony. It's not your traditional empire. The U.S. operates through this mind-bogglingly vast, interconnected web. We're talking military alliances, financial institutions, tech companies, diplomatic partnerships, and deeply ingrained cultural norms. It's never just one single element. It's an entire combined ecosystem where American power is simply a daily fact of global life.
Section 1. The 20th Century Turning Point, from Rising Scale to Global System Builder. Now, this whole system absolutely didn't appear overnight. It's really interesting to see exactly how this evolved. Back in the 19th century, European empires pretty much ran the world, while the US was quietly and rapidly building up massive internal scale and resources. Then, the 1910s hit, and the First World War dramatically weakened those European empires. Fast forward through the 20s and 30s, where the US took a pretty limited role and the Great Depression tanked global trade, we arrive at the 1940s. With Europe and Asia absolutely devastated by World War II, the US emerged as this industrial giant with its engines totally intact. And here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. Washington realized that military victory just wasn't enough. The post-war world needed a new set of rules, and America stepped right up to build that system. Which brings us to our next section, the pillars of power. Constructing the hard infrastructure. So, Washington deliberately constructed these pillars to project influence. Take 1944 at Bretton Woods. That is where the foundation of modern financial power was laid, making the US dollar the absolute central currency of the post-war monetary system. Representatives from dozens of countries got together to design a whole new monetary order, which gave birth to heavyweight institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. By linking the world's currencies to the US dollar, the United States gained an enormous, literally game-changing financial advantage. Even today, international trade, central bank reserves, global banking, it all heavily relies on the dollar. When the world needs money, it interacts with the American financial system. That grants Washington a staggering amount of global influence. Then, a few years later, in 1949, NATO was created. And this did something historically super unusual. It established a permanent, collective global military presence. Think about it. Instead of just packing up and going home after a massive war, the United States maintained its forces abroad. The core principle was collective defense. An attack on one was an attack on all. And right out of the gate, the U.S. became the undisputed most powerful military member of this sprawling new alliance. When you stack all these components together, they create a global military reach that America's rivals simply find way too difficult to reproduce. I mean, we're talking about projecting massive air power across oceans via aircraft carriers, having permanent bases that offer unmatched logistical access, advanced intelligence networks, strategic nuclear deterrence, and naval protection of global maritime routes. Add in major strategic alliances stretching from Europe to Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and by operating alongside these global partners, the U.S. essentially multiplies its power exponentially. Let's shift gears a bit. Section 3. The invisible influence, the secret weapon of voluntary participation. Hard power, like foreign soldiers on bases or tanks crossing a border, that is immediate and highly visible. But invisible power, that is far more subtle and, honestly, a lot more effective. We're talking about a kind of hegemony where billions of people voluntarily participate in the system simply because they find it beneficial. When the world uses your smartphones, watches your movies, speaks your language, and holds your dollars because it's just deeply integrated into daily life, that influence becomes almost imperceptible. We can really see how this invisible influence stacks up step by step to create incredibly deep entrenchment. First, you have Hollywood shaping the global image of lifestyles and popular culture. Then, that cultural pull flows into American universities, turning them into highly influential centers of global research that attract top global talent.
Step 3, that brain trust powers Silicon Valley to pioneer frontier technologies like modern computing and AI. And finally, that embeds global platforms, your Apples, Googles, Metas, worldwide. Suddenly, the entire digital economy is totally reliant on American standards.
And here's where it all ties together. Economic interdependence basically equals political leverage. This heavy reliance on American software or dollar financing creates intense dependencies. If a foreign bank relies on dollar financing or a manufacturer absolutely needs US-designed chips, they are locked into the US system. So Washington doesn't always need to send an aircraft carrier. Restricting access through financial or tech sanctions can yield absolutely devastating results. It's a real game changer.
Moving on to Section 4, the multipolar challenge, testing the American-led order. Now, American hegemony has never meant absolute control, and today, independent powers are actively testing this interconnected web. Just look at the strategic challenges. China is rapidly expanding its manufacturing, tech, and international currency use. The European Union is actively seeking greater strategic autonomy. Russia is openly challenging the European security order. Meanwhile, India is pursuing a strictly independent foreign policy, and much of the global south is choosing multi-alignment, basically seeking cooperation with several powers simultaneously rather than tying themselves exclusively to Washington.
But despite all these very real challenges, replacing a system this deeply integrated across finance, technology, and military is a completely different hurdle. And this is exactly why the US system persists. China might compete economically, and Russia might challenge militarily, but the US dollar, it remains the undisputed center of international finance and reserves. American military alliances remain extensive and highly active. US tech companies and universities maintain an outsized global influence. Simply put, no single alternative power has managed to replace the entire American-led system all at once. So the ultimate takeaway here is that American hegemony was never based on one single weapon, or one currency, or one company. It was built from layers. It's this unique ability to seamlessly weave diplomatic power with technological innovation and financial dominance with global cultural reach. Because these layers overlap and connect, they create a foundation that is incredibly resilient to isolated challenges.
To sum it all up, there's a thought that perfectly captures the essence of this whole explainer. It's the idea that the United States doesn't actually need to control every country. It only needs to remain central to the systems through which countries trade, communicate, finance, innovate, and protect themselves. That is true hegemony. It's just about being the irreplaceable center of the web. You might not see American soldiers in your town, but you're likely using American software, watching American media, and buying products tied to the U.S. financial system. America occupies an extraordinary number of the most central positions in everyday global life.
So, as we move further into a fragmented, multipolar world with brand new technologies and shifting alliances, the American-led order is undeniably being tested. The U.S. is going to remain incredibly powerful for sure. But the really profound question we all have to ask ourselves is this: how much of the world system will continue to voluntarily center on America? Keep questioning the systems that shape our globe, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.